My name is Charles. I'm in my late 30s now, and for most of my adult life, I was the kind of man people described as steady, dependable, the one who showed up early, stayed late, and didn't make much noise about it. I worked in a professional role that rewarded calm heads and quiet follow-through. I wasn't the loudest voice in the room, and I wasn't trying to be. I believed, for a long time, that consistency would speak for itself. People often underestimate men like me. They assume silence means passivity, that patience means a lack of depth, that if you don't argue, you don't feel things very deeply. I let those assumptions live unchallenged because they made life easier. When you're underestimated, expectations are low. And when expectations are low, no one notices the small fractures forming underneath. This story isn't about revenge. It isn't about triumph. It's not even about justice, in the way most people like to hear it. It's about a sequence of choices, quiet ones, rationalized ones, that led to a moment I still replay in my head, the moment I thought I was avoiding pain, when in reality, I was choosing a different kind of destruction. I chose my mistress over my wife during her miscarriage. She never spoke to me again. I'm not here to defend myself, and I'm not here to ask for sympathy. I'm here to tell the truth as clearly as I can, without theatrics, without excuses, and without reshaping the past to make it easier to live with. What you'll hear over the next hour or so is the slow build-up to that decision, not a single explosive argument, not a dramatic betrayal scene, just years of small cuts, quiet compromises, and a growing emotional blindness that I mistook for strength. At the time, I told myself I was acting out of fear of conflict, fear of collapse, fear of facing what I'd already damaged. I called it fear at the time. Now I call it the moment I destroyed everything. This is a story about invisibility, how it can feel safe, even virtuous, until it becomes corrosive. It's about silence, not as wisdom, but as avoidance. And it's about how some losses don't announce themselves with noise. They arrive quietly, close the door behind them, and leave you standing in a life that no longer recognizes you. I'm telling this story now because pretending I was a good man who made one bad decision is a lie I no longer want to live with. I was a man who made many small decisions that led somewhere irreversible. If you've ever looked back at a moment and realized you misunderstood it completely when it mattered most, have you ever asked yourself when things actually went wrong? To the people around me, I was uncomplicated. At work, I was the man who didn't need supervision. If something went wrong, I fixed it quietly. If a deadline was tight, I stayed late without announcing it. My name rarely came up in meetings unless someone needed confirmation that something was already handled. I wasn't the visionary, the closer, or the risk-taker. I was the stabilizer, the one who absorbed pressure so others didn't have to feel it. That reputation followed me everywhere. Friends described me as solid, the kind of man you could rely on to show up with jumper cables, to help you move without complaining, to listen without interrupting. I didn't dominate conversations. I asked questions. I remembered details. People mistook that for emotional intelligence. In truth, it was a survival skill I learned early. Pay attention. Don't disrupt. Don't demand too much space. In my marriage, that role hardened into something more rigid. To my wife, I was dependable to the point of predictability. I handled the bills. I kept the house running. I made sure nothing fell apart on the surface. When she was anxious, I became calm. When she was angry, I became quiet. When she needed reassurance, I gave it, carefully, logically, without ever fully revealing what I felt in return. I thought that was love. What I didn't see then was how invisible that made me. Not unseen in a tragic way, more like taken for granted. When you never demand attention, people stop checking if you need it. When you never raise your voice, people assume you don't have anything urgent to say. I became the background constant of my own life. At family gatherings, I was the one refilling drinks, clearing plates, smoothing over awkward moments. At work functions, I stood at the edge of conversations, nodding, smiling, absorbing. No one disliked me. That was part of the problem. Liking me required no effort, no adjustment, no curiosity. I told myself that being low maintenance was a virtue. Looking back, I can see how carefully I cultivated that perception. I didn't share doubts unless they were already resolved. I didn't express anger unless it was harmless. I avoided confrontation with an almost professional precision, not because I was noble, but because conflict threatened the one thing I believed kept me safe, being needed. If I were useful, I wouldn't be left. That belief shaped everything. It guided how I spoke, how I listened, and how I swallowed disappointment without labeling it as such. I confused endurance with maturity. I thought resilience meant never letting discomfort surface. My wife never described me as passionate. She described me as steady, the way someone might describe a reliable appliance. It wasn't meant unkindly. She trusted me. She relied on me. But she didn't wonder about me, and I didn't give her much reason to. I didn't realize that invisibility isn't neutral, it's cumulative. Each time my opinion wasn't asked, I told myself it didn't matter. Each time a decision was made without me, I reframed it as efficiency. Each time I felt something tighten in my chest, I labeled it stress and moved on. I became very good at narrating my own erasure as peace. No one forced me into that role. That's the part that's hardest to admit. I volunteered for it. I rewarded people for overlooking me by making it easy to do so. I trained them, slowly, to expect nothing emotional from me beyond reliability. And they learned the lesson well. The man I was to them, husband, colleague, friend, was not weak, but he was contained, predictable, safe. I didn't disrupt the emotional ecosystem of any room I entered, and because of that, no one noticed when something in me began to withdraw, including me. I thought being unseen meant being unthreatening. I didn't understand that it also meant being unprotected. The first moment didn't feel important at the time. That's how these things usually start, not with betrayal, but with something so minor. You'd feel embarrassed naming it as pain, a glance that doesn't linger, a decision made without asking, a comment delivered casually, with no intention to wound. For me, it happened on an ordinary evening at home. My wife and I were sitting at the kitchen table, laptops open, half watching the news. We were supposed to be discussing whether we'd visit her parents for the holidays. I had already checked my schedule, rearranged a few things at work, and mentally prepared for the trip. When I finally spoke, it was measured and calm. I think we should leave Friday night instead of Saturday morning. Traffic will be lighter. She didn't look up. We're leaving Saturday, she said, as if repeating something already decided. There was no edge in her voice, no irritation, just certainty. I waited a second, expecting a follow-up, a question, a reason. When none came, I added lightly, I can make Friday work if that helps. She sighed, not dramatically, just enough to signal inconvenience. Charles, it's already planned. My sister booked the Airbnb. That was it, conversation over. I nodded, closed my laptop, and told myself it wasn't worth pushing. People compromise in marriages all the time. This was nothing, except it wasn't about the trip. It was the ease with which my input had been erased, as it had never entered the room. I didn't challenge it. I didn't ask why I hadn't been included. I smiled and moved on. That's what I did best. But something stayed with me, a faint, uncomfortable awareness that I had been present, but irrelevant. Over the next few weeks, similar moments appeared, small, dismissible things. She'd make plans with friends and inform me afterward. She'd vent about her job, then wave off my suggestions with, "It's fine, you wouldn't get it." When we disagreed, she'd end the conversation by changing the subject, confident I wouldn't follow. No one else noticed. Why would they? There were no raised voices, no slammed doors. On the surface, our life looked functional, stable, even enviable. And I helped maintain that illusion. Each time I felt the sting, I reframed it. She's stressed. She's tired. This isn't personal. I told myself that asking for more consideration would be selfish, even petty. I'd built my identity on being the reasonable one. Admitting hurt would have meant dismantling that image. So I documented nothing. I confronted nothing. I simply remembered. That's the part people don't understand about quiet men. We notice everything. We just don't announce it. Every dismissal, every casual override, every time our presence becomes optional, we catalog it internally, even as we pretend it doesn't matter. At work, it happened too. A project I'd planned was reassigned without discussion. My manager praised the outcome in a meeting, crediting the team broadly, never mentioning my name. When I brought up a concern privately, he smiled and said, "You're adaptable. That's why this works." Adaptable. Another word for invisible. I nodded. I always nodded. None of this felt like a crisis. That's why it was dangerous. Pain that announces itself can be addressed. Pain that whispers convinces you it doesn't deserve attention. The first small cut didn't bleed. It didn't scar. It just opened a place where silence could enter. And silence, once invited, rarely leaves on its own. What began as an exception slowly became a pattern. Not a dramatic one. No escalation, no sharp turn. Just a quiet consistency that settled into my days, the way background noise does. You don't notice it until it stops. By then, it's already shaped how you think. I started expecting to be overruled. Not consciously, it was subtler than that. When my wife talked about plans, I waited to hear where I fit instead of offering input. When she vented, I listened without preparing a response, because I already knew it wouldn't be welcomed. I told myself this was maturity, that not every thought needed to be shared, that harmony mattered more than being heard. At work, I did the same thing. I stopped volunteering ideas in meetings unless I was asked directly. I let others present projects I had built. When credit was redistributed, I accepted it as part of the system. I told myself I didn't need recognition to feel secure, that my value was internal, not dependent on validation. That belief sounded noble. It wasn't. It was avoidance dressed up as virtue. The strange thing about normalized disrespect is that it doesn't feel like abuse. It feels like efficiency. Like you're removing friction from relationships. Every time I swallowed a response, I felt briefly relieved. No argument, no tension, no awkwardness. That relief was addictive, and so I kept choosing it. There were moments I almost spoke, moments where something in me leaned forward, ready to disrupt the pattern. A decision about money was made without me. A joke at my expense that landed too comfortably. A look of impatience when I asked a clarifying question. Each time, I hesitated just long enough for the moment to pass. I began editing myself in advance, filtering thoughts before they reached my mouth. I'd think, is this worth the energy? Will this change anything? The answer was usually no, or at least I convinced myself it was. What I didn't admit was that I was afraid. Afraid that if I asserted myself, I'd discover how little space there actually was for me. Afraid that pushing back would confirm what I already suspected. That my role was conditional, useful, but replaceable, appreciated, but not essential. So I stayed quiet and called it peace. My wife didn't become cruel, that's important to say. She wasn't malicious. She simply adjusted to the version of me I kept presenting. A man who didn't push, who didn't challenge, who absorbed and adapted. She trusted that if something mattered, I'd say so. I never did, and so she learned that my silence meant consent. I remember one evening clearly. She was scrolling on her phone, half listening as I mentioned feeling overwhelmed at work. She nodded, said, "That's just how it is sometimes," and returned to her screen. No follow-up, no curiosity. I stopped mid-sentence and didn't continue. She didn't notice. That was the moment something in me shifted, not sharply, but definitively. I realized that my interior life was becoming optional to the people closest to me, and worse, I was the one making it so. Normalizing disrespect doesn't happen because others push harder. It happens because you push back less. You teach people how to treat you by what you tolerate, and I had become very tolerant. I told myself I was choosing my battles. In reality, I was surrendering them all. The danger in that is subtle. You don't feel angry enough to act. You don't feel hurt enough to demand change. You just feel diminished, like a presence that's slowly fading at the edges. I began to feel more real when I was alone. In quiet moments, driving home, standing in the shower, lying awake at night, I'd replay conversations and imagine what I could have said. Not confrontational things, just honest ones, simple ones, that hurt. I'd like to be included. I don't agree. Those thoughts never made it into the world. Instead, I doubled down on being easy. I became more efficient, more accommodating, more invisible. I thought if I did enough, if I carried enough, someone would eventually notice the weight. No one did. And that's when disrespect stops feeling external and starts feeling internal. You begin to participate in your own erasure. You preemptively silence yourself so others don't have to. By the time I recognized this pattern, it already felt normal. Like this was just how life worked. Like wanting more was immature, even dangerous. I didn't realize then that silence, once normalized, doesn't just protect relationships. It reshapes them. Every system eventually assigns roles. Families do it, workplaces do it, marriages do it quietly, without announcements or consent forms. Roles emerge from repetition, from who speaks, who yields, who absorbs, who adapts. By the time you notice them, they already feel fixed. Mine was clear. I was the reliable one, the emotional shock absorber, the man who made things easier by making himself smaller. At work, my role was stability. I wasn't brought in to disrupt processes or challenge leadership. I was there to ensure continuity. When something broke, I fixed it. When someone left, I covered the gap. I became the infrastructure no one thought about until it failed. And because it never failed, it was never discussed. My manager once told me, "You're the kind of guy we don't have to worry about." He meant it as praise. I accepted it as such. In my marriage, the role was more intimate and more damaging. I was the emotional constant, the one who didn't need reassurance, didn't need space, didn't need much of anything. I was there to listen, to support, to stabilize. When my wife felt uncertain, my certainty filled the room. When she was overwhelmed, my calm absorbed it. But constancy, when unexamined, turns into expectation. She stopped asking how I was because the answer was always fine. She stopped checking in because I never seemed to need it. She assumed that if I had a problem, I'd handle it the way I handled everything else. Quietly, competently, alone. And I let her believe that. The role I was assigned didn't require vulnerability, it required availability. It didn't ask for depth, only presence. And presence without expression is easy to overlook. I remember realizing this one night while we were lying in bed. She was talking about her day, her frustrations, her hopes, her plans. I listened, as I always did. At some point, she paused and said, "You're so good at this. You're just steady." I smiled in the dark. Inside, something tightened. Because steadiness had become the only way she saw me. Not curiosity, not conflict, not desire, just reliability. I wasn't her equal in the emotional sense. I was her anchor. Useful, yes, but static. Anchors don't move, they hold. And people don't look at anchors. They trust them to stay where they are. Once I understood that, I couldn't unsee it. Conversations followed a script. Decisions flowed in one direction. Emotional energy was exchanged unevenly, and I was always the one giving more than I received. Not because she demanded it, but because I offered it freely, hoping it would eventually be reciprocated. It rarely was. The role extended beyond my marriage. Friends came to me to vent, not to ask, to unload, not to listen. I was the container, not the content. When I tried to share something personal, the conversation shifted back within minutes. They didn't mean to dismiss me. They simply didn't expect anything from me that required attention. I had trained them well. What's dangerous about roles like this is how reasonable they feel. I told myself I was being mature, supportive, and selfless. I compared myself to men who were volatile, demanding, emotionally erratic, and felt superior by contrast. But emotional absence isn't the same as emotional stability. One night, sitting alone in my car after work, I admitted something I'd never said out loud. I felt replaceable, not in a catastrophic way, just quietly, like if I disappeared, things would adjust, bills would be paid, schedules would be rearranged. People would say, "He was such a good guy," and then move on. That thought scared me, not because I wanted attention, but because I realized how little of myself I had actually placed into the world. I had become a function instead of a presence. And once you're reduced to a function, you can be optimized, minimized, eventually bypassed. The role I was assigned wasn't forced on me. I accepted it. I reinforced it. I lived inside it because it felt safer than asking for more. I didn't yet understand that safety and connection are not the same thing. The shift didn't happen during an argument. There was no confrontation, no ultimatum, no raised voice. In fact, the day itself was unremarkable. That's what makes it stand out now. Nothing dramatic marked it as a turning point, only a quiet clarity that arrived without asking permission. It was a weekday afternoon. I had left work early for a medical appointment, routine, unimportant. On the drive home, rain streaked across the windshield in thin, uneven lines. Traffic moved slowly. I remember feeling strangely detached, like I was watching my own life from a distance. When I walked into the apartment, my wife was on the phone. She glanced up, saw me, and turned slightly away as she continued talking. Her voice was animated, warm in a way I hadn't heard directed at me in some time. She laughed. She gestured with her free hand. I stood there, keys still in my hand, waiting for her to acknowledge me. She didn't. I don't know how long I stood there. Seconds, maybe a minute. Eventually, I set my keys down and went into the bedroom. She finished her call a few minutes later and came in, already mid-thought, continuing whatever conversation she'd been having. "I think I'll go out with them on Thursday," she said, like she was picking up a thread we'd been sharing. I nodded automatically, then something stopped me. Not anger, not resentment, just awareness. I realized that she hadn't asked how the appointment went. She hadn't asked why I was home early. She hadn't even noticed the pause where a human acknowledgement should have been. And I realized something else, just as clearly. If I didn't say anything now, I never would. The thought didn't scare me, it settled me. I said calmly, "I had a doctor's appointment today." She looked at me, surprised, not concerned, just caught off guard. "Oh, is everything okay?" The question felt procedural. "Yes," I said, and then, after a beat, "But I needed you to notice I was gone." The room went quiet, not tense, just still. She frowned slightly, confused. "You didn't say anything." "I know," I replied. That was the moment, not because of what was said, but because of what I felt. For the first time, I didn't feel like I was failing at being understood. I felt like I was observing a pattern from the outside, as if I had stepped back just far enough to see the shape of it. Her confusion wasn't cruelty, it was conditioning. She had learned, over time, that I would take care of myself, that my needs were minimal, that my silence meant stability. And I had learned that speaking up felt unnatural, almost intrusive. We didn't fight. She apologized lightly, promised to be more aware. I accepted it just as lightly. On the surface, nothing changed. Internally, everything did. That night, lying awake, I replayed years of moments like that. Times I had gone unnoticed. Times I had chosen quiet over connection. I didn't feel angry at her. I felt responsible, for the first time in a way that wasn't self-blaming, but honest. I saw how my silence had protected me from conflict, but cost me intimacy. How being needed had replaced being known. How the role I played had slowly emptied me of presence. Something else surfaced too, unexpectedly. A curiosity about who I might be if I stopped disappearing. It wasn't a desire to dominate or confront. It was a desire to exist fully, to take up space without apology, to stop translating my absence into virtue. That day didn't fix anything. It didn't heal my marriage. It didn't even change my behavior immediately. But it ended my denial. I stopped believing that my invisibility was accidental. I saw it as a choice I had been making, over and over, because it felt safer than risking rejection. Once you see that, you can't unsee it. The shift wasn't loud. It didn't announce itself. It simply removed my ability to pretend. After that day, my silence changed texture. Before, it had been reflexive, automatic, almost unconscious. I stayed quiet because it felt natural, because speaking felt like a disruption. But once I saw my silence clearly, I could no longer pretend it was accidental. Every moment I chose not to speak became deliberate, and that changed everything. I didn't suddenly start asserting myself. I didn't confront my wife or demand emotional recalibration. I didn't announce a transformation. On the surface, I remained the same man, calm, agreeable, predictable. But internally, I stopped disappearing by default. I began to notice the exact moment when words formed and died inside me. The fraction of a second where I decided whether to let a thought live or bury it. That pause had always been there. I just hadn't respected it. Now, I watched it carefully. And more often than not, I still chose silence. Not because I was afraid, but because I was observing. At work, when decisions were made without me, I didn't rush to fill the gap. I let the consequences unfold. When credit bypassed me, I noted who benefited and who noticed. I stopped smoothing over inefficiencies that weren't mine to fix. Not out of spite, but out of clarity. People mistook this for passivity. "You're so laid back," a colleague said once, smiling. "Nothing ever seems to bother you." I nodded. Let them believe that. In my marriage, the shift was even quieter. When my wife talked, I still listened, but I stopped compensating. I didn't anticipate her needs. I didn't preemptively adjust my schedule. If she made plans without me, I didn't automatically rearrange my life to accommodate them. I acknowledged them, neutrally. She noticed something was different, but she couldn't name it. "You're quiet lately," she said one evening. "I always am," I replied. She laughed, a little uncertainly. "I guess that's true." But it wasn't the same quiet. This silence had boundaries. It had intention. It wasn't an offering. It was a position. I began documenting things, not emotionally, but factually. Dates, conversations, decisions. Not in a dramatic way, just enough to establish patterns, enough to ground my own memory. Silence, I realized, is dangerous when it erases your own record of events. So I kept one. I didn't feel empowered. I felt focused. The old version of me believed silence was a way to preserve peace. The new understanding was colder. Silence preserves leverage when paired with awareness. Not power over others, but power over my own narrative. People around me began to misread the stillness. They assumed I was compliant, that I had accepted my role fully, that I wasn't paying attention. They were wrong. For the first time, I wasn't trying to be seen or unseen. I was simply present, watching how systems behaved when I stopped propping them up emotionally, watching how relationships recalibrated, or didn't, when I withdrew my invisible labor. Nothing exploded, nothing collapsed, but hairline fractures appeared. And I understood then that silence, when chosen consciously, is not weakness. It's preparation. Preparation doesn't announce itself. It looks like routine, like consistency, like nothing at all. That's why no one noticed what I was doing, because it didn't look like a change. It looked like I was still the same man, moving through the same days, filling the same spaces. But internally, I had stopped drifting. I started paying attention to patterns the way an outsider would. Not emotionally, structurally. Who initiated conversations? Who followed through? Who assumed availability? Who adjusted when plans changed? And who never had to? Once you see those patterns, you realize how rarely they're balanced. At work, I noticed how often I was included late in decision-making, only to execute outcomes already chosen. I tracked how my knowledge was relied on without my presence being required. I documented how often, "Can you handle this?" was said instead of, "What do you think?" So I stopped offering answers before questions were asked. I let pauses stretch. It was remarkable how quickly others filled the silence with assumptions. They assumed I agreed. They assumed I didn't care. They assumed I'd catch up. I let them. At home, I did the same thing. I listened more than ever, but I stopped translating. When my wife talked about stress, I didn't rush to reassure her. When she vented, I didn't immediately problem solve. I responded only to what was actually said, not what I guessed she needed. She interpreted this as distance. In reality, it was accuracy. I began reclaiming small pieces of my life without announcing them. I adjusted my schedule to include time alone, walks, reading, quiet mornings, not in defiance, just without explanation. When asked, I answered simply, no justifications, no apologies. People notice explanations more than boundaries. I stopped giving the former, and the latter became visible. I also began learning. Not in a dramatic, self-improvement way, quietly. I read about emotional dynamics in long-term relationships, about attachment styles, about how conflict avoidance often masquerades as kindness, about how being low maintenance is often a response to early instability. Nothing I read shocked me, it clarified. I realized that my greatest leverage wasn't control, money, or authority. It was my predictability. People had built expectations around my silence. They relied on it. And reliance creates vulnerability, just not where you expect it. I wasn't preparing to hurt anyone. I was preparing to stop absorbing damage. That distinction mattered to me. I also prepared for the possibility that nothing would change, that my marriage might continue exactly as it was. Even with my internal shift, I asked myself hard questions during long, quiet evenings. If this never improves, can I live like this? If I speak fully, am I prepared for what might be revealed? If I remain silent, am I choosing comfort over truth? Those questions didn't demand immediate answers. They demanded honesty. What no one noticed, what they couldn't have noticed, was that I was no longer operating from fear of loss. I was operating from clarity about cost. The cost of invisibility, the cost of peace without intimacy, the cost of being needed but not known. Once you calculate the cost, decisions stop feeling emotional. They feel inevitable. I wasn't planning an exit. I wasn't planning a confrontation. I was positioning myself to be able to choose, truly choose, without panic, without scrambling, without betraying myself in the process. From the outside, I was unchanged. From the inside, I was no longer improvising my life, and that made everything that came next possible. The reveal wasn't something I uncovered in a single moment. There was no email, no confession, no dramatic discovery that made my hands shake. It came together slowly, the way clarity often does, through accumulation, through noticing what aligned too neatly, what didn't require explanation anymore. It started with time. I realized how little of my wife's emotional life included me by default, not intentionally excluded, just unaccounted for. Conversations she took privately, evenings that filled themselves without consultation, decisions that arrived fully formed, as if the thinking had already happened somewhere else. I didn't accuse, I didn't probe, I observed. One evening, she mentioned a coworker's name in passing. Just a name, no story attached. Another time, she referenced something he'd said, assuming I already knew the context. The familiarity wasn't romantic on the surface. It was seamless, comfortable, unexamined. That's what caught my attention. When intimacy shifts, it doesn't announce itself as betrayal. It announces itself as easy. I didn't jump to conclusions. I checked my instincts against facts. Dates, timelines, emotional availability. I noticed how often she was energized after certain days. How her phone stayed closer than it used to. How conversations with me felt increasingly logistical. None of this proved anything, but it revealed something more important. I was no longer the primary emotional witness in my own marriage. And then there was the other reveal, the one that mattered more. I realized I had already emotionally stepped outside the relationship myself. Not with another person, not yet, but with a version of me that existed elsewhere. A version that didn't ask for permission to feel. A version that didn't shrink to maintain equilibrium. I had been living parallel to my own life, observing it instead of inhabiting it. That was the truth I hadn't wanted to name. The Mistress, when she eventually entered the story, didn't create this distance. She occupied it. The space was already there, cleared by years of quiet withdrawal on both sides. This realization didn't feel like relief. It felt like grief without tears. I sat alone one night, notebook open, and wrote a single sentence. This marriage is functioning, but it is no longer intimate. Seeing it in ink made it undeniable. There was no anger in that moment, no sense of moral superiority, just a sober understanding that something essential had already ended, and that we were both pretending otherwise. The private reveal wasn't about discovering wrongdoing. It was about discovering the truth. And once you do that privately, without witnesses, without justification, you lose the ability to hide behind confusion. You can't claim ignorance. You can't claim surprise. You can only choose what to do with what you now know. I closed the notebook and sat there for a long time, not planning, not rehearsing, just letting the clarity settle. No celebration, only wait. Because awareness doesn't free you, it obligates you. Once you see clearly, indecision becomes its own kind of decision. That was the place I found myself in. Not torn, not frantic, but suspended between options that all carried weight. For the first time in years, I didn't feel confused about what was happening. I felt burdened by the responsibility of responding to it honestly. There were several paths open to me. I could confront my wife directly, lay everything on the table, tell her I felt invisible, ask whether her emotional center had shifted elsewhere, demand a reckoning. That path promised clarity, but it also promised exposure. It would require me to speak in a language I had avoided for most of my life, vulnerability without retreat. I could retreat inward again, accept the marriage as functional, stable, quietly hollow, continue playing my role. Many people do this for decades. It would cost me something, but it would preserve the structure of our life. No disruption, no explanations to friends or family, no hard conversations. Or I could choose something else entirely. At the time, I didn't label it escape. I called it distance, a controlled deviation, a way to feel present without detonating the life I'd built. I told myself it wasn't about desire, it was about being seen. That's the lie I still examine the most carefully. The Mistress entered my life without force. No grand seduction, just a conversation that didn't require translation. Curiosity that wasn't conditional, attention that felt deliberate. When she asked how I was, she waited for the answer. That alone felt destabilizing. I knew what I was doing as it happened. That's important. I wasn't swept away. I didn't lose control. I made a series of conscious, incremental choices, each one justified by the last. I told myself I wasn't hurting anyone yet. I told myself I deserved space. I told myself clarity sometimes comes from contrast. Each justification was clean, reasonable, incomplete. The real decision point wasn't when I crossed a physical line. It was earlier, when I chose not to repair what was breaking at home, because I was already rehearsing a life where I didn't have to. That was the irreversible choice. By the time my wife became pregnant, the structure of our marriage was already compromised. We shared logistics, history, obligations, but not presence. When the pregnancy complications began, I felt fear, yes, but also distance. A terrible, disqualifying distance I didn't know how to bridge. When the miscarriage happened, I was not where I should have been. I chose the person who made me feel visible over the person who needed me most. I told myself I was paralyzed, that I didn't know what to do. I was afraid of making things worse. I called it fear at the time. Now I call it the moment I destroyed everything. There is no justification for that choice, only context. I didn't leave in anger. I didn't storm out. I simply didn't show up. And absence, in moments like that, speaks louder than any betrayal. That was the decision point. Not a fork in the road, but a quiet step off it. And there was no going back. After the miscarriage, nothing shattered outwardly. There were no screaming phone calls, no dramatic scenes, no immediate fallout that matched the gravity of what had happened. That absence of chaos almost convinced me, briefly, that the damage might be containable. It wasn't. It was just quiet. My wife stopped speaking to me in full sentences. Communication narrowed to logistics, then thinned further into silence. She moved through the apartment like someone sharing space with a stranger. Polite, distant, precise. No accusations, no questions. That should have terrified me. Instead, I interpreted it as space. That was my final act of self-deception. I didn't try to explain myself, not because I lacked words, but because I sensed, correctly, that words would only serve me. Anything I said would be an attempt to reframe, to soften, to reclaim some moral footing. And I knew, even then, that I didn't deserve it. So I began to move in silence. I adjusted finances quietly, opened a separate account, reviewed documents I had ignored for years, not in anticipation of divorce, not consciously, but in recognition that the structure of our life had already changed. I didn't hide anything illegally. I didn't manipulate. I simply prepared. At work, I requested projects that required travel. Nothing suspicious, just distance. Space that felt justified. People accepted it easily. I was, after all, adaptable. I stayed with the mistress briefly, long enough to confirm what I already suspected. The clarity I felt with her was real, but it wasn't sustainable. She had entered my life as contrast, not as a foundation. Once the illusion of refuge dissolved, so did the urgency. I ended it quietly. Not because I regained my morals, but because I finally understood the shape of my damage. I wasn't seeking love. I was seeking relief from invisibility, and relief is a poor substitute for responsibility. My wife noticed none of this preparation, or maybe she noticed and chose not to engage. Grief changes perception. It narrows focus. It hardens boundaries. She stopped asking where I was going. I stopped offering explanations. We coexisted in a space emptied of expectation. I told myself I was being respectful by giving her space. I told myself I was avoiding further harm. But the truth was more uncomfortable. I was avoiding witnessing the full impact of my absence. Moving in silence felt controlled, dignified, even. No more fumbling, no more justifications. I had learned, finally, how to disappear efficiently. But silence doesn't undo harm. It just delays the reckoning. And reckoning, I would learn, does not require confrontation to be absolute. It only requires finality. Consequences rarely arrive all at once. They come unevenly, like cold settling into a house, room by room. You don't notice it immediately. You adjust. You put on a sweater. You tell yourself it's temporary. But eventually, you realize the warmth isn't coming back. That's how it began. My wife didn't confront me. She didn't demand explanations or closure. Instead, she withdrew with a precision that felt intentional. She stopped asking questions, not because she didn't care, but because she had already concluded that answers wouldn't help her survive what she was carrying. Grief doesn't always look like collapse. Sometimes it looks like efficiency. She organized her days around absence. She made decisions without me, and no longer bothered to inform me of them. Appointments, dinners, weekends away. I learned about them only when they intersected with the logistics, when she needed the car, when she wouldn't be home. I noticed the first real consequence when she removed me from her emotional vocabulary. She stopped using we. It was subtle. I'm going to stay with my sister. I've decided to take some time off work. I think I need space. Each sentence is clean, self-contained, final. I had spent years fearing abandonment in theory. This was something else entirely. This wasn't abandonment, it was detachment. At work, things began to shift too. The projects I had quietly stepped back from didn't fail, but they changed shape. Others struggled with details I had once handled automatically. Deadlines slipped, communication fractured. People asked questions that used to come to me instinctively. My manager noticed. "You seem less available," he said once carefully. I agreed. For the first time, my invisibility had consequences for others, and that disturbed me more than I expected. I had always believed my absence would be easily absorbed. Watching small systems strain without my silent labor forced me to confront how much of myself I had been giving away without recognition or boundaries. But the most significant consequence wasn't external. It was internal. I began to feel the full weight of what I had avoided. Not guilt in the abstract, but specificity, the exact moment I didn't show up, the exact silence that followed, the understanding that some forms of pain don't demand explanation. They simply record your absence and respond accordingly. I realized then that my wife wasn't punishing me. She was protecting herself. And protection, once activated, doesn't negotiate. There's a moment when urgency appears, not as panic, but as recognition. By the time it reached me, it was already late. I could feel the shift in how my wife occupied space. She no longer moved around me. She moved through the apartment with intention, as if every step had already been decided somewhere else. The air between us wasn't tense, it was settled, and that terrified me far more than anger ever could have. I tried, quietly, to re-enter. Not with grand gestures, not with apologies that would center my own relief. Just small attempts at presence. I asked how she was sleeping. I offered to make dinner. I mentioned counseling, not insistently, just as a possibility. She listened politely. Then she said, "I don't have the energy to explain myself to you." That sentence ended something. It wasn't cruel, it wasn't loud, it was simply accurate. Explanation requires trust, that the listener will hold what's shared with care. I had already proven, at the worst possible moment, that I could not be trusted with her pain. I realized then that timing is not neutral. Support given too late isn't support, it's an intrusion. I had mistaken her silence for space, when it was actually distance being constructed. Carefully, deliberately. Every day, I delayed showing up fully. She was learning how to live without me in ways that didn't require negotiation. I felt panic for the first time. Not emotional chaos, but a sharp internal awareness that something irreversible was happening. I wanted to rewind to the point, before choices had hardened into outcomes, to explain my fear, my confusion, the way I had misunderstood myself. But an explanation is only useful before harm is finalized. Afterward, it's just noise. She didn't yell. She didn't cry in front of me. She didn't ask why. Those absences were devastating. They meant she had already done the emotional work alone. She had already processed the loss, not just of the pregnancy, but of the marriage she thought she was in. I saw it in how she spoke to others. Calm, composed. No mention of me beyond logistics. I had become a background detail in her narrative. That was the cost of not showing up when it mattered most. I understood then that repair requires two people willing to reopen wounds. She was done bleeding. She had moved into closure while I was still trying to negotiate meaning. And closure does not respond to urgency. It responds to consistency, which I no longer had. The conversation, when it finally happened, was almost clinical. No raised voices, no trembling hands, no dramatic pauses meant to wound. She asked me to sit down one evening after dinner, if you could call it dinner. We had been eating separately for weeks by then, our schedules no longer intersecting unless necessary. She didn't accuse me of anything. That was the first thing that disarmed me. She didn't mention the mistress. She didn't ask where I had been or who I had chosen. She didn't demand an explanation for the day I wasn't there. It was as if she had already answered those questions for herself, and found that none of the answers changed what she needed to do next. "I'm not angry," she said calmly. "I'm just done." I waited for more, some opening, some space where I could speak. None came. She told me she had started therapy, that she had leaned on her sister, that she had learned something about herself. In the silence I left behind, something she wished she had never had to learn, but now couldn't unlearn. "I know I can survive without you," she said, and that changed everything. There was no cruelty in her voice, no satisfaction, just certainty. I tried to respond carefully. I acknowledged my absence. I told her I was afraid, that I had been lost, that I didn't know how to show up without collapsing. Each sentence sounded reasonable in my head. Out loud, they sounded irrelevant. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she nodded once. "I believe you," she said, "but I don't trust you." That distinction landed with devastating clarity. Trust isn't rebuilt with understanding. It's rebuilt with presence over time, and I had already missed the moment that required it most. The miscarriage wasn't just a loss, it was a threshold, and I hadn't crossed it with her. She wasn't asking me to leave immediately. There was no deadline, no dramatic severing, just a clear statement of direction. I won't be married to someone who disappears when things get unbearable, she said, even if I understand why. That was the confrontation. No heat, no spectacle, just the quiet authority of someone who had already made peace with her decision. I realized then that all my careful silence, all my preparation, all my attempts to control outcomes, none of it mattered in the face of a boundary drawn without malice. She wasn't punishing me. She was choosing herself. And for the first time, I didn't try to argue with that. I live a quieter life now. Not the performative quiet I once mistook for strength, but a deliberate one, structured, honest, and far less forgiving of self-deception. The noise that used to fill my days, constant accommodation, silent calculations, emotional avoidance, has thinned out. What's left is simpler, but heavier. I am no longer married. That fact settled slowly. There was no dramatic separation scene, no single day that marked the end. Just a gradual unthreading of shared routines until what remained was paperwork and memory. Friends asked what happened. I told them the truth, carefully. Not the version that absolves me, and not the version that turns her into a symbol, just the facts. Most people didn't know what to do with that. Neither did I, at first. I spent a long time examining my own patterns without trying to justify them. Why I equated silence with virtue. Why I believed being needed was safer than being known. Why fear made me choose absence at the exact moment presence was required. Those questions don't resolve neatly. They linger. I still work in a similar field. I'm still competent, still reliable, but I no longer volunteer to disappear. When something matters, I say so. When I don't understand, I ask. When something hurts, I name it. Not dramatically, not accusatorily, but clearly. That has cost me some ease. It has also given me integrity. I don't pretend that this growth redeems what I failed to do. It doesn't. Some losses aren't lessons. They're consequences. I accept that. The woman I was married to no longer speaks to me, and I understand why. Silence, when chosen by the wounded, is not avoidance. It's self-preservation. I respect it now. I've learned that quiet dominance isn't about withholding emotion or controlling outcomes. It's about having the courage to remain present when discomfort threatens your self-image. It's about not outsourcing your moral responsibility to fear. The man I am now is not invisible. He's not loud either. He simply stays. There's a temptation, when telling a story like this, to wrap it in redemption, to point to growth and say it balanced the loss, to frame suffering as a necessary teacher, to imply that everything happened for a reason. I don't believe that. Some events don't arrive to educate you. They arrive to mark you. This is one of those. The miscarriage didn't just end a pregnancy. It revealed a fault line that had been there long before anything broke. My failure wasn't sudden. It was cumulative, built from years of choosing comfort over clarity, silence over honesty, usefulness over presence. I didn't betray my wife in a moment of passion. I betrayed her slowly by not practicing being emotionally available before she needed it most. That's the part I wish more people understood. You don't learn how to show up in a crisis. You reveal how you've been living all along. At the time, I told myself I was afraid of making things worse, afraid of saying the wrong thing, afraid of collapsing under the weight of someone else's pain. Those fears felt real, and they were. But fear doesn't excuse absence, it explains it. And explanation is not absolution. If there is a moral here, it isn't don't cheat, or don't withdraw, or even don't be afraid. Those are surface conclusions. The deeper truth is harder and less comforting. If you train the people you love to survive without you, don't be surprised when they do. My wife didn't leave because I chose someone else in a moment of weakness. She left because I had already taught her, over the years, that my presence was conditional. That was when things became unbearable. I might disappear. She believed me. Now, when I think about quiet dominance, I don't think about control, leverage, or restraint. I think about responsibility. About staying visible even when it risks rejection. About letting your emotional presence be known before it's tested. Silence can be powerful, but silence used to avoid yourself is destructive. If this story unsettled you, that's not an accident. It's not meant to offer comfort. It's meant to invite reflection, especially if you recognize parts of yourself in mine. So I'll leave you with this, and I genuinely want to hear your answer in the comments. Have you ever realized, too late, that the moment you thought you were protecting yourself was actually the moment you abandoned someone who needed you? Thank you for listening.